Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. Sorry for the wait, but I have a really good and informative read this week. I read The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America by Ellis Cose. Now, this book was released in 2020 and it was published by Amistad, which is a HarperCollins imprint. Essentially, this is an explanation of freedom of speech in tandem with an explanation on Supreme Court rulings and rulings of the Court of Public Opinion. Now, Ellis Cose is someone who is not an amateur at all. He's a journalist. He's written for plenty of outlets, and he's an author, and he's authored books like Democracy, If We Can Keep It, as well as The Rage of a Privileged Class. So this is someone who is used to covering Americans, essentially. Now, before we get into any more of this, let's talk free speech. So the reason this is even a book, the reason we're even talking about this is because free speech is a defining ideal of America. For those that don't know, the founding fathers were descendants of those that were persecuted. And so America was essentially created as a refuge. So free speech, in essence, if it's challenged at all, that's typically a catalyst for war or revolution or overall unrest. So that's why it's such a hot topic in America, because of where, America started. The writing style is very much influenced by journalism, and that's because there's a lot of research. I didn't expect this book to give me as much information on court rulings from various time periods as it did. So it's informative in that sense. He also references journalist coverage of past events and, those court rulings and essentially the views of that society. There's a level of analysis, which includes, deducing what the founders meant and how their foresight or lack thereof has placed us into the current position. And lastly, I would say for the most part, this book is, I really hate cars and motorcycles and trucks, whatever it is. I hate the way that they just go zooming down the street for no reason, loud, whatever. But lastly, this book is for the most part objective, being that it explores battling viewpoints. I said for the most part because there is a lot of references to Donald Trump's presidency, and that in itself is a very polarizing discussion when you're talking about him. So it's very clear what our author thinks about Donald Trump, but and that's not to say that it's without reason, but it's the rest of the book is very much what happened, what were the rulings, what's written, and how we go from there. So now usually I would do the themes next. However, I'm going to go along with the structure that was given to us by Mr. Cose, because each chapter and the introduction and the epilogue give us a chronological explanation of freedom of speech in America. So it makes sense for me to kind of just go through each chapter, and within that, you'll kind of pick up on the themes that are discussed. Now, another thing that the chapters do is that it juxtaposes contemporary events against preceding standings. So it's always nice to see the contrast in things that were set in stone in the late 1700s or 1800s versus what's happening right now, and how different, things can become in just a few hundred years. Okay, so the introduction is titled Defending Hateful Speech. So this immediately frames the events in Charlottesville at the whites' rights protest. So this in itself, it shows, recent free speech discussions, which establishes relevancy. So why are we even talking about free speech? Well, this is one example as to why we need to kind of look at it a little bit more. We're also introduced to our first court ruling, which is the New York Times versus Sullivan. And essentially the conclusion was the press can't be held for libel unless reckless disregard can be proven or they were intentionally malicious. So essentially, when a public figure, prints something in a newspaper or whatever, the person that is being talked about can't really sue them unless they can prove that this person knowingly, spread misinformation or knowingly was malicious. Now, the reason we're introduced to this is because Mark Zuckerberg actually used this ruling to kind of defend Facebook. He misinterpreted it. That's what really happened. And if you're not familiar with what is happening with Facebook, I don't know if they're still embroiled in a few cases, but back when he was writing this, there was a lot of conversation on what can be shared on Facebook, because what they found was there were a lot of misinformation and, quote unquote, fake news being spread through Facebook. And that contributes to the overall, elections and campaigns and things like that. So Zuckerberg took it upon himself to, use this court case in defense, but it really didn't work. Because, I'll say this. If you're interested, any court ruling you can Google. I did it a few times when I was reading this book, and it'll give you exactly, the date of the court ruling. It'll give you a synopsis of what happened. It'll give you the conclusion and who voted for and against it. So I would recommend that, if you see a case that you're not familiar with or that you can't understand, to just Google it. There's archives, online endlessly, and read up on it for yourself so you can see kind of how wrong Zuckerberg was. I think he was just grasping at straws because, he's just trying to defend his product. So, and lastly, in the introduction, we are introduced to the counter speech doctrine from 1927, and this was by Justice Brandys, I don't know, but we're going to talk about him a little bit more. But basically, the idea behind this was that really censorship isn't necessary. We need everyone to speak up. We need more speech. Why? Because the good will always outweigh the bad. So that's the start of a discussion that we're going to get into in a few moments, and we can see just how not applicable that is. Okay, Chapter 1, Liberating the First Amendment. So this gives you the definition of freedom of speech in the second paragraph. The short version is basically any speech that is covered by the First Amendment. If you want the long, it's not long, it's like a paragraph definition. You can go to Chapter 1, second paragraph, it's in there. So of course now we have to talk about, okay, what's free speech versus what is protected speech? To give you an example, you cannot scream fire in a crowd of people when there's no fire. You can't scream bomb on a plane when there's no bomb, because it creates a lot of commotion. Sometimes that can lead to, even more destruction because people are panicking. So that's kind of an example of, I guess technically that's free speech, but it's not protected. So first of all, we're really not talking about free speech. We're talking about what is covered under the First Amendment. Now, to talk about the title of the book, The Short Life and Curious Death, what Cose means by that is So the freedom of speech was implemented, in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, in 1791. It didn't last, more than a decade. It lasted less than that because the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 started to put limitations on, speech. Professor Thomas Healy is quoted as saying, despite its centrality to our culture today, the First Amendment in the early 20th century was largely a dead letter. So this goes to show that there's never been a time where speech was completely free. So that's one thing we really have to understand. Now, the conversation of what should be free speech, what should be under protected speech, that's what really people are talking about. But when we're talking about this broad idea of freedom of speech, it's never really been free. Chapter 1 also gave us a look at early cancel culture, which is interesting because I was hoping that this topic would be covered in this book in present day, and it is. We're going to talk about that in a few chapters. But it's interesting that in the 1800s, having any Republican views or speaking out against slavery meant financial ruin, and it meant harassment in the South at the time. Now, understand this. The Democrats and the Republicans in the 1800s are not what they are today. Essentially, the platforms were flipped. So the Republicans were very generally, anti-slavery. And in the South, where slavery is, a major part of the economy, having those views was not like your business would be destroyed. You would be forced to move to a different state, a different city, move up north probably. And the justification by slave owners was speaking out against slavery could destroy the value of our property, because it will incite, slaves to run away and leave. So it's funny that cancel culture has always been a thing. We may not look at it that way, but that's what that was. It wasn't illegal to have views different from, the majority in the South, but the people around you were not going to let you get away with thinking differently than them. Okay. Now, John Powell actually has a good quote on this. Free speech was always in service to something. And now, speaking present day, it's actually being used as a weapon against people and institutions. So this is what I was talking about as far as, online, the Twitter mob. It goes back to that notion that nothing happening today is new. Humans have been through all of these issues before. We're just recycling them in a different way because, Twitter wasn't a thing back then. And Raymond de Souza actually put it perfectly. So are we essentially talking about freedom of speech without virtue? We're allowing people to speak up, maybe on hateful views, and sometimes they take advantage of the hate around them, and they, conduct heinous crimes. But, that's freedom of speech. That's their right. So this is where we start talking about, where do we draw the line? What is freedom of speech? What is freedom of speech that can get somebody hurt or killed? So it's the comment on the cost of protecting speech. Chapter 2, titled The Root of All Evil. So this is about political donations. It's about money. It's about the political action committees, or PACs, that raise money for the candidates, which includes dark money. That's kind of like money that you can't really place. It's unlimited funds that they're funneling into the PACs. Why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Well, because corporations obviously have a better ability to contribute a huge sum of money than average citizens, and this influences the candidates. And so if someone gives you a bunch of money to run for president, they're going to want some favor once you become president, down the line. So what does this mean? Well, the CEOs of this company are given a larger voice in elections than citizens. And when you really sit down to think about that, it's true, because the CEO or whoever's at the top, whoever is making the calls, they're the ones that are swaying, the elections or the goodwill in their favor, and they're going to get more favor over the people because, they've contributed more money. So this ties into speech because we're talking about First Amendment privileges. So humans versus corporations. And I encourage everyone to read this book, if for nothing else, to understand why free speech and election contributions overlap, because it was very interesting to see just how influential corporations can be, and it's all protected for them, whereas citizens are not really given, that much leeway. But essentially, corporations are paying for campaign marketing, and this is covered under freedom of speech. But then you have to understand that that money is probably going to be used to cover malicious and, not so great things on other candidates. So they're contributing to the slander at times that candidates are now throwing at each other on all sides. And so it's like, who's going to be held responsible for that? Because, obviously the candidates should be, but who's funding it? The corporations. Chapter 3, titled What You're Seeing Is Not What's Happening. And that makes me feel like we're in 1984. If you haven't read that, check it out. It's a staple in the literary community. It's also very scary. But this is actually titled after a phrase from Donald Trump's speech. So it's funny because we're talking about the consequences of the media's attempt to be fairly critical. And what was discussed in this chapter was basically how, for example, CNN, who is not a fan of Trump, would just play his speeches over and over to, criticize it, but you're still giving this person a platform, even if you don't agree with them or you don't like them, whatever it is. So not only is Trump being, covered on the networks that like him, he's being played on everything else. And so it's interesting how media, they kind of did this to all of us, because you have to be mindful of what you're putting out to the people. A quote directly from that chapter by Cose is, "Chronic liars and con artists have found themselves elevated to the level of thoughtful public figures." A prime example that's not political is the Tinder swindler. I haven't had a chance to see this. It's a documentary, I think, on Netflix. But this guy, who is a con artist, admittedly, now has a manager, a Hollywood manager, and an agent, and is talking about doing all these great things. Not great, but he's gonna, be an actor or something, or run a company. Well, he's famous because he's a con artist. This is insane. And this goes to show, what's really happening. It's insane when you really think about some of the people that are famous and why they are famous, and understanding that along with that fame comes business opportunities that, regular people are working for over here, but whatever. And this is where we have a critique of Brandys Theory. So the whole idea that giving everyone a voice, eventually the good will outweigh the bad. That's not applicable in the 21st century, because we have social media where literally everyone can have a voice. And what that does is it gives an audience to people that let's just say in their real life, they may only talk to 5 people. So 5 people may hear, their outrageous, incomplete thoughts. But now on Twitter, they're tweeting these things out, and they're able to find pockets of people all over, and it spreads. And a lot of it is, like I said, it's not very thought out. I don't want to say it's dumb, but some of it's dumb. A lot of it's not researched. And so we find that Brandys Theory is no longer applicable. And it wasn't really ever applicable, but now it's just more noticeable that the more people you give the ability to speak, most of them are going to say a lot of dumb stuff. So, almost said a bad word. Next, chapter 4. I feel like I'm sweating. And it's freezing out. Okay. Next is chapter 4, when words lead to violence. This is kind of self-explanatory. You know what to expect in this chapter. This is really discussing politics and how having different views can sometimes lead to blows, which we've seen over the past few years. But the whole idea that you reacting to criticism and reacting to another person's, freedom of speech, it is displayed through Charles Sumner and Preston Smith Brooks. So Charles Sumner, he gave a speech. It was anti-slavery. Preston Smith Brooks took offense to that and literally caned him. And I think they were in a government building, walked up to him and caned him, beat him up really badly. And he was celebrated after that. But so now let's take a look at this situation in terms of free speech. Does Charles Sumner have the right to, give an anti-slavery speech? Of course he does. But now he has to deal with the reaction of someone who is clearly opposed to what he's saying. So is it really freedom of speech if you have to go through, fighting someone for it? Is that free? But then again, it's you're dealing with people who have very differing views. And at this time, slavery was something that was polarizing. So, okay, chapter 5. What the founders never imagined, technology. Social media has amplified the voices of people who cannot form coherent statements. Headline culture rules the kids, and it teaches impulsivity. People don't read through whole articles. Your article could be very well thought out, could be accurate, analytical, objective. People are going to go with the headlines, and companies are aware of that. There's a lot of companies that, or not even companies, just blogs that post headlines that are inflammatory or designed to get an emotional reaction out of you. And you see that and you run. So there's no filter of information. The good does not outweigh the bad on Twitter. Twitter is a wild place. And all of the social media apps are wild. And what keeps me using them, one, I've said this in the past, it's a good marketing technique. 2, there is a good side of social media. I think social media is hilarious. There's posts that I have saved specifically because it makes me laugh. But boy, is the negativity outrageous. And it's addictive. It's addictive to see people talk crazy and be cruel and compare yourself and all that other stuff. So, and I just said this, but when it comes to social media, should everyone have the right to make a Twitter account? I don't think so. But that's against the First Amendment. So we're really at a really tough situation right now, because I don't think that obviously this was ever in the foresight of the founders that we would have some form of communication with the entire world instantaneously. And now it's we need to kind of redo. We need to redo our system a little bit and what we decide is protected speech. Okay, number 6, shaking up the Senate. I'm not going to lie. This is where he kind of lost me. I felt like the momentum was stalled a little bit because I couldn't understand why we were talking about the Senate and its problems in this book. Not that I felt the information was inaccurate, but like, I'm like, we're talking about freedom of speech. It made sense towards the end though, because obviously the Senate is who's going to be deciding essentially everything. And what this chapter was about, basically the voting structure sucks, the Electoral College. So he broke it down very well. And again, my few points are, very broad, but if you really want to get into that more, please read his book. He actually references a few other books on that like authors have like actually sat down and analyzed the Electoral College. So if you are someone who is really into that, I haven't decided if I want to go down that rabbit hole yet, but I would recommend, reading this chapter and then taking his recommendations. But essentially the idea that one person has one vote, it's not really a thing. And that's due to gerrymandering, which is manipulating the boundaries, within states for significant change in electoral voting. So what this really does is, in high populated urban cities, minorities have less of a say than they think they do. And Cose's solution to this is another great migration. Have minority voters move to the rural, and their votes will, technically be more representative. And it'll change kind of the tides of things. Again, that is a very broad, very amateur explanation, but he breaks it down very well and it makes a lot of sense. Will it ever happen? Probably not, but I enjoyed reading about it. Okay, number 7, flirting with tyranny. This was interesting, and I wanted to hit on one case in particular, but a quote straight from the book is, "We abandon the Bill of Rights when we feel threatened." So, for example, in times of war, and that's very true. And I think that's a very human, reaction to something. When you feel threatened, all of those rules and structure that you put into place, no. Everyone needs to get on the same side so we can attack or defeat this immediate threat. So it makes a lot of sense. However, in the case of Robert Goldstein, and this was really crazy. So he was a director or a writer or something like that, but he made a film called The Spirit of 76. He released this film in 1917. He released it about a month after the U.S. entered World War I. Now, the problem with this film was, if you haven't caught on to the whole 76 thing, it was about, the Revolutionary War, and it was about the Wyoming Valley Massacre, which involved British soldiers massacring a town. Now, Goldstein was charged with treason under the Espionage Act. Why? Well, because since the United States was in World War I, allied with Great Britain, producing content that, framed Britain in a bad light was seen as something that was treasonous, because it could potentially sour the relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain and potentially lose the war. That was outrageous. I could totally see it happening though, and I understand why the U.S. had that reaction, because they're looking at it like, we can't mess up a relationship with Great Britain, but it's outrageous to find someone, guilty under a treason act for producing a film about history. That was true. It's not like we made this up. So that's a very exaggerated example of, the lengths that the U.S. will go to when it comes to crossing that line of freedom of speech. Because did he have a right to produce that film? Of course. He wasn't lying. He wasn't malicious with anything. But, they found him guilty, which was crazy to me. But, the title of the chapter is Flirting with Tyranny. And that's something that's like, seriously, really, Okay, chapter 8, Strident Students and Silenced Voters. What I really pulled from this was the conversation on cancel culture. So a quote directly from the book says, "We're not going to protect anyone from cyberbullying because we have this sacred cow called speech." So that's kind of like, why are we protecting speech? Just because we say that that's what we do? What's the point behind all of this? Well, There were a few events depicted in this chapter. Essentially, there are a lot of heated conversations happening on campus between, different sides, because there's been a lot of polarizing events in the past few years. I remember actually being on campus when one of the events that he discussed was happening. And I remember how much of a pick your side kind of thing it was. But it's important that someone's, first of all, having those conversations, insightful conversations, although it does go too far though, because you cannot ruin the reputation of someone who has a different opinion than you. That's what I got from this. And I think, and I've had to correct myself a lot, because it's easy to go with the narrative that because this person thinks differently, they wish me harm. Sometimes that can be the case, but because something is foreign to you, that does not mean this person has to be silenced forever. Or because someone made a mistake. Or most of the time, they're just ignorant. We can't silence someone and punish someone for, not knowing or just for thinking differently. And I think that it's very easy to do this, especially when you have the coverage of a keyboard. You don't have to really see anyone face to face. You can put your 2 cents in and be like, yeah, this person, they should be fired, or let's all call this person's job. I really have been very reflective over the past few years about how crazy this is. And I'm going to be honest, throughout all of the reading that I've been doing, even with just this book alone, I truly believe that this period of time is going to go down in history. Not for all the other crazy stuff that's been happening, but because people are going to look back and say, you guys did exactly what happened with the Red Scare, what happened with the McCarthy trials, what happened with the witch trials. You can't just constantly put people on trial and say that they're bad because they're different. That's not how this works, and that's not freedom of speech. Now, is there a line? Sure, but let's talk about the line, and let's not hold people to impossible standards of perfection and always knowing the right things to say and do. So that's just my little thing. And it's something that I really have to remind myself with. You need to look at this objectively. It's not in anyone's best interest to just label someone bad or terrible or, the devil just because they think differently than you. So I did like that chapter, and I think it was important that it was kind of centered around students, but Cose did give students props because, outside of college campuses, who's really having conversations or discussions or sometimes arguments with people on the other side? It's like once you go out into the world, you only talk to people that think like you. You only, hang out with people that vote the way you do. And I'm not trying to do that. So yeah, that was a very good chapter. But all in all to say, I don't think cancel culture is the main thing threatening free speech. There's a lot that's happening around this, but it's something that we really need to be mindful of. And social media, really has to, I don't know if they need to come together and make a coalition to figure out how to combat this, but just because you haven't been on the end of a Twitter mob yet, you think it's cool to run with the pack. I feel very sorry for those, even people that I don't agree with, and I see them getting constantly attacked, and people are calling their jobs and their family members. That's terrible. That's terrible. And I don't think our grandchildren are going to think that that's okay. I don't know. That's just let me step off my soapbox. But I did like that was included in here because I think that is an issue that's not really talked about enough. Okay, last chapter, Destroying Democracy, Defending Speech. This is really just a commentary on President Trump's former President Trump's presidency, and how essentially Trump brought the ethos of the internet to traditional media. He's everything that happens on the internet. That's what it is, saying everything that's on your mind, being unfiltered. And I think that's why it attracted a lot of people, because it was new and fresh. but also because it's something that's familiar now. You know, people talk like that on Twitter all the time. So the internet age has shown us that free expression can be poisonous. I think that sums up my last, 10 minutes of talking very well. And the epilogue just wraps up, the conclusion. It's titled A Virus, Partisanship, and Truth. It also gives us the beginnings of a conversation on what happened in May of 2020, which for those of you that cannot remember, centered around the death of George Floyd. And a lot of protests worldwide had, in the wake of that. So all in all, we covered a bunch of themes, honestly. And at first I was listing them all out, but it was like, let's just go through the chapters one by one. So the themes covered include politics and money, corruption, public ignorance, the weaponization of freedom of speech, political propaganda, and the boundaries of freedom of speech. So I think that this book is very relevant. Speech is on the battleground of almost every polarizing discussion. The last few years have been embroiled in these discussions, and the government documents and court rulings dictate the standards of free speech. And that's why it's important to know, those court rulings and what happened. So therefore, such rulings should be studied to bolster every American's knowledge. So that's my plug, to just read more books. And why should you read this book? Well, because of the emphasis on the court rulings along the timeline of free speech. It shows you exactly how we got to the place that we are and why it's so difficult to defend or condemn certain, freedoms of speech. So I have two takeaways. First, free speech generally hasn't been free since the late 1700s. And no one knows how to define those necessary freedoms. So if anything, I hope that this book starts conversations with anyone that's listening, and maybe we can figure out a solution to this issue within the next couple of generations, because it's bad out here. People are wild. So that's it. I will see you guys in a few days on Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Thank you.